Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 79 in the series. I'm calling this one Craft and Protest, and yes, it is normally a podcast that's about garment design and DIY and modifications, but at this kind of momentous time in the history of the United States and the world, it seems that I would be very remiss if I just put out a regular old podcast and was silent about what's going on, especially in the United States, but also the protests that are going on around the world. After the murder of George Floyd, and so many more before him, police brutality, institutionalized racism, and all the conversations that we're having about free speech and rights to assemble. So today I'm kind of putting on my professor hat a little bit, I guess, and I want to spend some time thinking about how craft and protest actually kind of feed into each other, and they're actually integral to each other in ways that I think are actually pretty profound and helpful, hopefully helpful, in thinking about some of the events that have been going on around the world and in the United States in particular. And I may not say all the right things. I'm a teacher. I recognize that there's always more learning to do, but I really do think that not saying something is more hurtful, absolutely, than saying anything, just trying your best to put something out there. And that kind of is part of one of the principles that I'll talk about of overlap between craft and protest. So I want to spend a little time talking about that. And as many of you know, I'm a professor at the University of Illinois. I teach in the English department. I teach speculative fiction, science fiction. And in those classes, I'm often looking for marginalized voices to include in the syllabus. So I'd like to kind of come at this from that angle, and I was trying to think, as I was thinking about this episode, where I could add maybe a note to the conversation and come from like a genuine place of where I've been working on trying to understand issues of power and infrastructure and systemic racism and things like that. So we're going to talk about that. I do have a little bit of knitting to talk about. I've been kind of working on this blanket, though many of you, maybe like me, haven't been able to concentrate as much on knitting. Knitting is often one of those things that is soothing, and we can go to it and we can pick it up and it brings us peace. But right now I find that I'm not having a lot of peace in my life, and I don't think a lot of other people are having a lot of peace in their life. For those of you who aren't finding that knitting is working for you right now, you're not alone. And if you are finding some kind of quiet and peace in your knitting, I think that's wonderful, and I encourage you to keep going. So one of the reasons I wanted to call this episode Craft and Protest is that I think some of the principles that I've been working with for this podcast for years now also apply to helping sort through what's going on in the world. So I'll just kind of run through those and see if they do help you. I'd like to know, and if they don't, if you think about it differently, I'd really like to know that too. So the first one is, this is a podcast that's often about taking multiple routes to accomplish a particular goal. So I think maybe principle number one is that there's no single right way to do something in craft or in protest. And I know I've seen a lot of folks who are, they're upset because they can't participate in ways that they want to because of the pandemic, because of any number of reasons. But I just want to encourage everyone to say, I've been saying this a lot, is each in their own way, or each in her own way. There's no single right way to do something. And if your protest is about donating money, or if it's about picking up books and reading, if it's about having conversations with people in your life, if it's about taking to the streets, whatever it is, just like in craft, just like in spinning, just like in knitting, there's usually multiple ways to do something the right way. And I would say an even better way to say it is there's no one right way to do something. The second principle might be something like modify, be flexible, be open to learning and changing your perspective. And it's okay to try and try again. If you mess up the first time, or you don't feel like you got it right the first time, if you're making a sweater or if you're trying to make a statement, just try again. It's okay to keep trying. It's okay to keep modifying and to keep learning and considering different perspectives and kind of building yourself up as a person rather than breaking yourself down. Judgment this isn't really a place for policing and judgment. It's more about trying and reaching out and doing the work and doing the work to learn, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. And that kind of leads me to number 3, which is to try to educate yourself. It's something we do on this podcast all the time. Pick up the books, create the communities, listen to people, and the more you can kind of read and discuss and challenge what you think you know, the better off you're going to be. Ask questions when you don't understand, and seek out any kind of information that seems like it's that those in power don't want you to have. That's the information that you want. So those are my 3 principles, and I think that they link craft and protest pretty nicely. There's no single right way to do something. It's important to be flexible and modify things, and it's really important to educate yourself and create ways for you to learn new things and meet new people and hear new stories. So those are my 3 principles, and for whatever reason, they've been kind of helping me think about how what we do here in this community is actually really tightly linked to the rest of the world, and that what we learn here and what we learn as knitters and spinners can actually help us out in the world and the bigger community. Now, I also think that understanding power dynamics in the US and in the world is like it's a lifetime of learning, and it's something that's taken me a long time. And I've been through college, I've been through a master's program, I've been through a PhD program, I've written dissertations, I've written books, I've taught classes, and I still learn new things. And I think that understanding like how power works in different infrastructures and how it works on different people and for different bodies is an incredibly complex thing, and it's not something that you can just learn like instantly, right? Like the idea that you're going to pick up one book and be like, okay, I understand institutionalized racism is probably not going to work out. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't pick up the book. It doesn't mean you shouldn't start somewhere. It doesn't mean you can't learn from that and then build on it and like build your little bricks until you have a full sense of what's going on. So for me, I feel like in teaching and in reading and learning, I learn something new every day. I learn something new from my classes every day, from my students. They're constantly teaching me things. I'll bring in one thing to class and then I'll hear back from them something I had never thought of. And in those moments, I think are the most kind of interesting and helpful that you can have. So that's partially about building that community and having those discussions. And the other thing that I wanted to say on here, in terms of speaking from a kind of like genuine place, a place where I feel like I have some knowledge that might be shareable and helpful, I wanted to share with you guys basically a list of books that I've been teaching from and reading myself over the last couple of years. And I'm going to put that list of books in the notes here on YouTube and over in the show notes, which are on the blog. And those books, I wish I had them with me right now. That would be the best. But because of the pandemic, they're in my office at school, and I don't have them with me right now. I need to go get them so I can plan my science fiction class. But one thing I've encountered in teaching is that a lot of the ways that we learn, a lot of the texts that we read tend to be centered in places where we take for granted that is the mainstream, right? If there's sets of canonical literature that you're supposed to have read, they often don't include marginalized voices. And so I remember when I started teaching my science fiction class way back in the early 2000s, one of the big principles I had in teaching that class was that I was going to teach it with a feminist angle. I was going to get women authors in there. I was going to get different perspectives from feminism, from the LGBT community, from different places that aren't mainstream in science fiction. And so I've done that for many, many years. And then I started teaching a speculative futures class. And one of the first things that struck me about teaching about the future was that often the future was a very white, middle upper class future that didn't include a lot of other people. And in looking at those futures, I think it's important to recognize like what's not there. Like if you're looking for those absences, then suddenly you can say to yourself, this future is actually telling me a hell of a lot about the present. and what we assume to be normal and mainstream in the present. And so I started looking for alternate futures, and I found them. They're out there. There are so many of them, and they're wonderful, not only in terms of bringing in questions of race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, all of those things. So in that vein, I have a list of texts that I'd like to share with you below and over in the show notes, and a lot of them are collections of writing from authors who are coming from different perspectives and different positions. They allow you to think about your own position, and they allow you to think about like how the present is affecting and infecting the future, and what futures are actually possible. Some of them are dystopic and not hopeful. Some of them are hopeful. And I think that that's important to remember right now too, is we're seeing a lot of violence, and we're seeing a lot of amazing strength, and we're seeing a lot of people putting themselves on the line, and we're seeing a lot of fear, and we're seeing a lot of stress, but there is hope, and a lot of these narratives for the future in both science fiction and speculative fiction offer that kind of hope. So they're really great texts to go to if you're looking for change and you're looking for different perspectives and ways to kind of approach our present and what we hope will be the future. So I would recommend Octavia Butler, anything by Octavia Butler, but particularly Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. I would recommend Mothership and Afrofuturism, which are a couple of different collections of Afrofuturist work that are wonderful. There's a book called Resist, Tales from a Future Worth Fighting For, which I think is a great title, and it's full of excellent short stories. A People's Future of the United States. We've got a couple other interesting ones. Shades Within Us is about diaspora and immigration in the U.S. And Iraq Plus 100 is about the Iraqi diaspora and what it's like to imagine a future, whether it's hopeful or just imagining a future period when you're living through a kind of moment of a horrific present. There's also some great short stories out there. W.E.B. Dubois wrote a short story called The Comet, which is really revealing, and I taught that in my apocalypse class last year. I'm going to teach it again in my science fiction class coming up. And then there are other folks like George Saunders who are writing stories like Semplica Diaries that reveal a lot about white privilege and about commodity culture and lots of other things. So that's my kind of short list of just a few of the books that I would recommend if you're interested in thinking about these questions of race, racial inequality, infrastructural racism, and trying to think about the future and hope for the future at a time when there's a lot of protest going on and a lot of instability and uncertainty. Maybe the future that we build can come from some of these places and people who have been writing for quite a long time about possible futures, but who have been somewhat ignored by the mainstream. So that's my contribution. I know a lot of you have asked me over the years like what I teach and what kinds of texts I would recommend, and those are definitely some of the great texts that I've been reading over the last couple of years that I think are relevant to what we're seeing and talking about today. So with everything going on, like many of you, I've been kind of glued to a computer screen. I've been reading as much as possible. I've been listening and hearing a lot of stories. And I've been kind of knitting as a very, very unconscious background thing. And while that's okay, I have also not been working on a project that I truly like to work on like day after day after day, because in part I just don't have the headspace to kind of start something new. I have a sweater project I want to work on. I have some stuffed creature things I want to work on. But right now what I have cast on is this blanket, the Persian Dreams blanket, the worsted version by Denise Hope. And it's a lovely blanket, and it's a wonderful background project, something that you'd pick up from time to time over, say, the span of a year and work on. But right now I'm just working on it kind of repetitively, and I will say I'm sadly not enjoying it as much as I wish I were, and I think that's for a lot of different reasons. But I have made some progress on it. This is, I've got 8 squares done so far. and they're all tagged with the yarn I'm using and the number of the square, because these all have to be kind of put together in a particular order in the blanket. And I'm doing the kind of stained glass version of this that a couple of other crafters and a couple other project pages put together. And so I'm using a plain black background, and I'm using a gradient yarn for all of the colorwork changes. And that gradient yarn is, I'm using the Knit Picks Chroma, which is the this stuff, Knit Picks Chroma worsted. Pretty affordable yarn. The thing about it is that it's a singles yarn, so it's very splitty. It's like a bulky singles. And I think for any of you who have ever used this before, it's a very bulky singles, and it likes to split if you're trying to do color work with it. So it's a little bit frustrating to work with. Maybe not the best choice on my part. But I've been kind of just chugging along with it, and like I said, I have 8 squares done, so that's out of 24, so I'm about a third of the way done. I'm hoping to get the headspace to be able to start something new, at least just a couple of hours to start something new, so that I can just have this as a background project again. But we'll see how that goes. A couple of things that I found that made this project easier this time around, and I say this time around because I picked it up years ago when it first came out, and tried to knit it before I had done a lot of color work, and I found it to be a little bit frustrating because it is a center out pattern. So you're starting with basically the pinhole cast on here, and then you're increasing as you go. And so if you're trying to do all that and do color work, and you're a novice color work knitter, that can be very frustrating and fiddly with the fingers. But when I picked this up now after knitting, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 color work sweaters, that part is not that difficult anymore. And I hear the dogs roaming around. But I also found a couple of quick tutorials that were super helpful. The first was a pinhole cast on tutorial by Shelly of Very Pink Knits, and I will put a link to that in the show notes. There's a link to it over on my Ravelry project page for the blanket. Super simple cast on. Like I went from having a cast on that I was like kind of crazy dislike of, like I really didn't like it at all. I couldn't figure it out. It was fiddly. It just wasn't working for me. And then I found Shelly's version, and it's just kind of like, it's just the best. It's amazing. I love it. So I will forever make a pinhole cast on the Shelly way. And then I found a couple great tutorials about the make one away and make one toward increases that you need to use to create the hexagon shape. And again, those links are going to be in the show notes. And if you're working on this blanket, they are lifesavers, and they really just made the whole thing very, very simple. And I think you can kind of see the increases a little bit better actually on the back. They run up at each of the kind of spokes of the hexagon. So those are 2 tutorials that if you're making this blanket are absolutely necessary, for me at least. I'm a visual learner. I need to learn from people a lot of the times, and those tutorials were amazing. The other thing I wanted to mention is when you're doing a blanket like this and you've kind of substituted a gradient yarn for the actual colors that are supposed to be in this. So what I mean to say is in Janice's original pattern, the colors of the hexagon change. So you're actually knitting with like multiple colors as you are increasing the size of your hexagon. So you would maybe have some blue here and some pink, and then you'd have some orange and that kind of thing. But when you're knitting with a gradient yarn, you end up with the color flow that the gradient yarn wants to do. And in a case like this, like in this hexagon, I love the way it turned out, because we have, you know, this beautiful blue blossoming into this kind of pinky, the orange, and then the yellow on the outside. I feel like it just, there's something about this square that just really makes my heart sing. The way that the colors kind of melt and change at that pace, like I really just love that. But then there are other squares, like the one I'm working on right now, not squares, hexagons, that end up being, because I've been doing this and not really paying too much attention to it, ended up being a little bit more yellow or greenish, you know, with not a lot of color change. So it looks so much more plain. I mean, you compare the two, and it's just that it's like apples and oranges, right? So one thing I wanted to mention, all of this is to say, when you're working with a gradient yarn and you cake it up so that you can actually see the colors that are coming and see the kind of colors that are moving through that skein or ball of yarn, you can actually make decisions about how you use that yarn. So you don't have to be just tied to whatever it is that's coming up from the gradient yarn next, right? And right now it looks to me like I'm going to be stuck with this yellow for this hexagon for a very long time. Had I been thinking, I would have actually cut the yarn and started from one of these other colors to create more of the square that I truly love. This one that has the multiple color change variations. So even if you're working with a gradient yarn, you're not stuck with the gradient that you've been given. You can ball it up, you can see how the colors are going to progress, and you don't be afraid to cut and change and shorten sections if you want to have an interesting transition at a certain kind of point. You can kind of guesstimate about how much yarn, yardage-wise, you need for each transition if you want to get really into the math. But more than that, you can just kind of decide, I'm done with yellow here. Like, as I was working on this, I could have said to myself, oh my God, there's too much yellow. So I could have, at this point, cut the yellow and then added in the next colorway, which would have been, let's say, this more like peachy salmon-y kind of color in here. So you still have control even when you're working with a gradient yarn, and I think that's important to remember, especially if you're working on a blanket like this one, where you're ending up with different manifestations of the same color chart. So these, for example, like this one is from Sugar Cookie and this one is from Groovy, and they're very different even though the charts are actually the same chart, right? This one is much more of a monotone, like a very low contrast difference between the light purple in the center and the light blue and the pink, and this one has a much more high contrast distinction. Now it's not that I don't like this one, I actually think this one works pretty well. I think the problem comes when you end up with that kind of solid yellow in a blanket that pretty much has a lot of color and a lot of life in it that isn't just that plain yellow. So those are my two tips for this blanket, which so far has been speeding right along, kind of, at this kind of like weirdly unconscious rate. I've just been popping out hexagons, I guess. I guess that's been my meditation. And my hope is that I don't keep popping out hexagons, that I find some headspace to do something else. But we'll see. I mean, if nothing else happens, I'll have a blanket really, really soon. Sooner than I ever imagined. But do check out those tutorials if you're interested in this blanket, or if you're just working on center out knitting of any kind. That pinhole cast on from Shelly at Very Pink Knits is awesome. The best I've ever seen. And I am working towards some other projects. Like I said, I've got some stuffed creatures coming that are actually pretty big. They're going to be like 13 or 16 inches tall once I get around to them. That book that I've been using doesn't have any charts though. So it's color work without charts, which is confusing to my brain. So I think I'm going to actually draw up some charts. I printed out some graph paper. I think I'm going to do some coloring and color in some charts for myself so that it's a little bit easier to follow the pattern for the bodies of those animals. And then I do have a couple sweaters that I want to knit. There was a great period at the very beginning of the pandemic when a lot of designers were kind enough to put out patterns, offer them for free for folks. And I have a few of those downloaded, and I really want to jump into a few of them. So once I get a little bit more clear in my brain, that's something I'll do. At the same time, I'm not buying a lot of yarn. I've been donating money to, all along during the pandemic, I've been donating money to our local food banks, and you know, like the NAACP and some of the bailout coalitions in the last couple of weeks. So I'm kind of saving my money for some of those purposes rather than buying yarn. So new sweater projects will have to come from the stash, which will be okay. And speaking of the stash, I would like to donate half the proceeds of the Shop My Stash sale that's going on over on Ravelry to organizations that are promoting social justice, racial equity, things like that. So if you're interested in getting yarn and donating to a good cause, please head over to the Ravelry stash page that I have up, and I will donate 50% of the proceeds over there to causes dealing with social inequity and racial justice. So I think that's about it for today, guys. I will post those book recommendations below in the notes on YouTube and over on the show notes, which are always on my blog at knittingthestash.wordpress.com. And I just want to end by saying, if you're out there protesting, I commend you. Keep up the good work. If you are reading and encountering new ideas and new stories and trying to learn about infrastructures and power systems and the ways that this world is working against marginalized voices, I commend you. Keep doing that reading, keep studying. As a teacher, that's like the thing I want most for my students and for people I talk to, is like I want you to just feel like you have the space to learn and grow and think about new things and encounter new ideas and think critically about them. So keep going. And for everyone else who's unsure of what to do, it's okay if you just do something. Whatever it is, if it's talking to your kids, if it's reading a book, if it's donating money, if it's holding up a sign, if it's putting a sign in your front yard, whatever it is, do it and don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in. Yeah. All right, I'll see you next time, guys.